morning, welcome. I'm here with David Reed. David, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
I think we're in a strange situation actually, where I think I know you a little bit better than you know me. I've seen you at a few conferences and I've been to a few of your sessions. And I think you run webinars on authoring tools before, which I've attended, that were quite interesting. So I thought you were quite well placed. But it's been a while since we've been at the same conferences. I think the last one I might have seen you at was Bali 2019, where you were doing something on corpora.
Yes, that sounds reasonable. I suppose COVID obviously knocked so much of that on the head, but yes, I haven't been sort of back out since then, maybe. But would love to and be out there presenting again soon.
Yeah, I think it's been a while, but everything's shifted online still. But yeah. At the time, I remember you're really involved in authoring materials and e-learning authoring materials, which is kind of the topic of the day. And I thought you're particularly well placed to talk about this, given the sort of things you've been doing at Sheffield. So, do you want to can you just give us a bit about your background and what your current role is and how you're involved in these tools and how they've affected your teaching and learning provision there?
Yeah, I'm a very sort of potted version. I've been an English language teacher for about 31 years. Worked all over the world, so 11, 12 countries, then came back to the UK. I think I'd always had an interest in technology. And I came to work at the University of Sheffield at the English Language Teaching Centre, initially as a teacher, and then I became the sort of default learning technologist there. After a few years, they decided this was quite sort of an important thing that they needed to have a sort of a dedicated role for. So then I was made the director of technology at our centre. And so my job and role was to sort of oversee the sort of delivery of materials online, the creation of any sort of online materials, training for teachers and students in using online tools and digital products, and then obviously once the pandemic hit, my job suddenly became to manage that whole process of taking everyone online as well, and obviously that was interesting times. But I think even before the pandemic, and in fact one of the reasons why I think we coped better in the pandemic than a lot of centres was that we'd already moved a lot of our content online. We'd flipped a lot of our materials, to cope with a sort of an influx of students that we'd had at our centre, which meant that we had a lot of sort of pre-existing materials that we could use with students. And through that process of flipping a lot of content, I managed to learn quite a bit, both myself and my colleagues who I was working with, about tools that were appropriate for creating online content. And we experimented using a whole range of them, from the sort of the free stuff to the sort of the more expensive paid authoring tools as well.
Yeah, so maybe we'll just jump in here with a couple of definitions. When we talk about e-authoring tools, what sort of tools are you thinking about, and what are their capabilities?
I think it's such a broad concept, but I think any tool that allows you to create digital content, particularly of an interactive nature, that then can be delivered to students often asynchronously via, a VLE or a web page or a mobile app. This is the kind of thing where we're thinking about, the sort of interactions we're looking at could be it could be video, could be sort of media. It could be, interactive questions, dragging and dropping things, clicking on things, clicking on pictures, circling things, whatever. There's a whole range of these tools that could do a whole range of things, from quite simple to really quite sophisticated.
Yeah, so I think for me, when I first got involved in this, the two things that leapt out at me were that differentiated what we call e-authoring tools from what we've been able to do traditionally was this idea of interactivity, and so slightly upping the ante with regard to what students can get engaged with. And also instant feedback. So it opened the possibility for flipping more of your activities out into asynchronous learning, because with things like, if you're language teaching, for example, comprehension checking questions and things like that, a lot of this could be done outside of class. So they could rather, one of the great sort of benefits was it freed up a lot of class time, because teachers weren't standing there going through answers, for example, of directing students to parts of a text that they might be using.
And kind of presenting as well. And I think there's, it saved a lot of that sort of checking answers, but it also saved a lot of these sort of periods where teachers maybe just stood at the front of the class, just presenting information to students, and maybe not as consistently well as a piece of flipped content could do that. Because obviously, if you create a piece of content which is informing or presenting information to students, that's a sort of a fixed thing. You can spend, hours crafting it so it's really clear and understandable to students. Whereas in class, obviously, there is the benefit that there is that kind of interactive element with teachers, but also teachers could be sometimes, tired and unclear and all of those things. Whereas, with flipped content, it made sure that content got across to them, and it left more time for the chat and the talk and the interactivity with the teacher in class to try to sort of clarify, extend their understanding of the materials as well.
So did you find that was happening when you started rolling these out more, that the structure of classes themselves were changing for the better because of what these tools could do?
We think so. It took time. I think the big challenge is it's so difficult to break the habits of a lifetime, essentially, for teachers. So I think one of the biggest things we didn't necessarily want to do when we started flipping content, what we didn't want teachers to do was to then just spend the first half an hour checking the content that had been flipped, basically. Because the content should have already done that. It should have already gone through the content and given them some basic sort of comprehension checks of the materials. But I think what happened a lot was that teachers would just go through the materials again and go, have you done the materials? And did you understand this? Did you understand that? And they weren't really sort of taking the materials and sort of then extending them in the classroom. So it needed a lot of training of teachers to help them understand what it means to sort of to flip materials, and then what do you do in the classroom after that? Because it's such an unusual thing. It's such a new thing for teachers to do. They got so used to a mode, sort of presentation mode. You check the homework, you then present the new information, and then check that and things like that. This idea of going straight into sort of extension and discussion and clarification, it was very new for teachers, and it really took a lot of. We had to extend sort of the amount of training we did with teachers before courses to help them understand that.
Yeah. So you were using, was it Articulate Storyline? Is that the...
We did, yeah. Mainly we were using Articulate Storyline as our e-authoring tool. I think, it is the sort of industry standard as far as I understand for, for a lot of institutions, individuals who develop, authoring materials. And, it's got a very similar layout to things like PowerPoint. So it's familiar in its structure and its layout. And if you've done any kind of video editing, or if you've created any kind of presentation, it helps to bring together some of those elements. So it's a relatively easy tool to use compared to some of these other tools, which often the back end can be quite complex. I don't know if you've ever used things like Xerti or tools like that. The back end, what you do, it's not a sort of a WYSIWYG interface. It's not what you see is what you get. The kind of back end is very different from what the final creation is. Whereas something like Articulate, what you're creating kind of looks like the final thing you're going to make as well.
Yeah, so I think there are a range of these tools available. You've got Articulate being something that you pay a fair amount per license for that, but it's a great interface. It's very slick and easy to use. I think Xerti is something we use at York, and it is free with caveats. Open source in any sense, but as you say, it's quite tricky. It takes a bit of getting used to the interface. It's not immediately what you see is what you get. I think in the middle ground, a lot of people listening might be more familiar with H5P because I think it comes. Is it still bundled with Moodle?
It is. I think it's an interesting one because, on some levels you get free depending on what platform you're using. So, for example, if you're using Moodle, it's integrated. I think it is also integrated to things like Blackboard, although that's on a institutional basis, whether they kind of pay for it or integrate it or something like that. We have Blackboard, but we don't have H5P at Sheffield. Like if you have WordPress, if you have a website, you can get it for free through that, or you can pay H5P a sort of a license fee for them to kind of store the materials. And in fact, that's something that we do because we do use H5P quite a lot across some of our content and across various sort of courses and things we make. So we do pay a sort of an annual license fee for them so that we can create content on their platform.
Right. So if people want to get involved in this, whether you're, teachers or just learning designers or designing for other people, there's a whole range of things that you can check out and explore.
Yeah.
I think even things like I don't know if it's still going, but there's one called WordWall, which was just very quick and easy to get up and running if you wanted to spice up, interactive tasks to stick on your VLE or something like that.
It is, and relatively cheap in comparison. Yeah. There's no real free option for WordWall. They let you create a couple of sort of activities, but it's quite limited. But the kind of the paid version, and certainly the individual license, is about £60 or something a year, which I know it's not cheap, but it's certainly cheaper than a lot of these other e-authoring tools. But it does allow you to create, digital content. Nice thing about WordWall, also allows you to download it as sort of photocopies as well. So you can kind of create the content, and if you do need sort of a handout version of it, I think that's another key thing about it. And I think that's when you're looking at e-authoring tools, it's good to have a little sort of criteria for what, for how to choose them, because the big problem is it's a bit like AI at the moment. There's all these AI tools out there. 90% of them are going to disappear in a year. So, the fear is that you commit to something and then they disappear and suddenly all your content has disappeared. I don't know if you've ever had that experience of, we've had the experience in the past where we've created content using a particular platform and then that platform absolutely went down the drain or got bought up or something like that, or went bankrupt, and then all of that content was lost. We did it with a video platform called Zaption a few years back, and we invested quite a lot of time and effort and money into it, only for it then all to disappear when it was bought up, I think, by someone else.
Well, the tricky thing as well is when you're checking tools out, and you before you invest in things at an institutional level, or even sometimes pay for a license yourself, you try the free version, and it will give you limited access, and you create some learning objects and things, and then so you have some of these things that you're using in your teaching materials, but you're then at the mercy of, whether they could get maybe they just cease, or maybe they just suddenly restrict all their permissions, and it can be a bit inhibiting sometimes. But if you're lucky enough to work for an institution that pays for the access, then it can be really great.
I think that's one of the things to look at is how transportable is the content that you're creating. And I think one of the reasons why we've stuck with things like Articulate, H5P to a certain degree, is that they are not limited to the platform they're created in, essentially, in the sense that in most cases they can be downloaded or put into a different format, and then they will exist forever regardless of whether you have access to the authoring platform itself. So like Articulate, you can download them as what called SCORM packages, for example. And then these could be uploaded to your VLE, to Moodle, Blackboard, Canva, any of these things. And they will still function. You may not be able to edit them later, but they will still function regardless. And the same with H5P. I think H5P, you can still run, you can download and run H5P files in your browser locally almost. So again, you can store them locally. And even if you don't necessarily have access in the future, then they can be run on the platform. And I think that's a key consideration when you're doing that, because you don't want that situation where you've created lots of content and then suddenly it's blocked or hidden.
Is that true for the free version? So let's say you're on a trial, you wanted to check out one of these tools, and you've got a trial of Articulate, and you create some learning objects. Do you get to keep them?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, they're very good, actually. Articulate with the trials, I find that they'll often, not only they'll give you like a month trial, they'll often extend that to a second month. Because I think they know that if people are really finding it useful, they will probably pay ultimately. But you do need time, I think, with these tools to be able to do that. What I quite like about them is they also, they offer a sort of a PowerPointy type interface for creating content, but they also, as part, you basically buy a suite. You don't just buy one product. You get something called Articulate Storyline, which is the sort of the slide interface and the PowerPoint interface for creating content. But you also get something called Articulate Rise, which is a sort of a web-based content creation tool as well, which is all done online. And it creates these, perhaps more mobile-friendly web pages that can be accessed on mobile devices. It's perhaps a bit more limited in the functionality, but it allows you to create particularly things like guides and sort of self-study workbooks, which is really useful. And they have a very good sort of review system where anything you create in Articulate can be sent to something called Articulate Review, I think, where people can comment on it, and rather you might comment on a Google Doc or Microsoft Word document, you can do a similar thing with this. So it's a sort of a full suite of sort of authoring tools, basically.
Yeah, one of the things that you mentioned earlier, I just wanted to really jump back to, because it was the teacher's reaction to this, these tools, that I think is really interesting, because it's something that I've come across as well. So to recap a little bit, we've got these tools that they add a few dimensions to the teaching materials that we could normally produce. So they're interactive. We can embed them on the VLE. They look really nice. They're quite engaging. So, for example, teachers who might be used to working with documents, for example, your teaching materials might be on a Word document or a PDF, which you download and sort of distribute somehow to the students. There's that. The great thing about these tools is they remove a barrier, so that instead of having to click and download a document, you can embed and work straight from there. So we've got a few advantages, and they're quite, there's many ways in which these are appealing, and the instant feedback and freeing up class time. But as you say, there is a bit of a shift required from teachers themselves, and I think that might be more pronounced as well if you're in this situation where you're designing teaching materials to be delivered by a team of teachers that are not you, for example.
Yeah.
It's one thing if you're trying new tools in your own teaching, but you have to. I think, did you try them on a pre-sessional course? Is that
We did, yeah. I mean, and that's how primarily we use them as a sort of they are basically 50% of our pre-sessional courses are these flip materials.
Right.
So that's that's our main use. We use them across a range of courses, but that was our initial use and our main use in terms of flip materials.
And I think, as you made the point earlier, you put on a batch of training and you really familiarise the teachers with the tools. And did you get because it's a bit of a shift in how you run the class? So I think, just go back to a point you made earlier about it frees up more time for a bit of chat and discussion, and there's more possibility for just what they call deeper level learning, revisiting concepts. I think it's more in the spirit of what flipped learning was intended to do. Did you find that even with the training that this was quite a shift for teachers, and they were coming out of a comfort zone, that if they were more used to a kind of information transmission mode of teaching, and that this was something they had to adapt to?
They really did. And like I said, we did try our best to kind of assist them with this, we actually did sessions on flip learning and what is it? Because we understood, particularly in earlier days, I think we started this in about 2018. For a lot of teachers, it was still quite a new concept. So we had to do sort of whole sessions explaining the concept behind flip learning, an overview of that, and then look at how to, specifically apply that to our context and what that would mean in terms of what they do in the classroom as well. But, some teachers adapted to it better than others, I think, and maybe, some of the younger teachers, perhaps it was easier for them because they perhaps had a bit less baggage when they went into the classroom. Teachers who've been teaching perhaps a longer time, that's the sort of turning the tanker a little bit, in terms of changing approaches to the classroom, I think. So that was really difficult. But we did observations. We tried to support people through a variety of means. We ran additional sessions throughout our summer program to try to help teachers with that as well. But it's an ongoing challenge, I think. There is sort of an inertia where you go back to your natural style of teaching and trying to understand that, some of the teaching has already been done for you is such a tricky one, because the danger is it just gets turned into homework, which is not what it is. And I think that, the difference between flip learning and homework is it's an important distinction.
Yeah.
That one is it's a continuation of the lesson. The flip learning is a continuation of the lesson. It's not something that's supposed to sort of, be an extension of the lesson, or you do extra or optional at homework. It's part of the sort of the ongoing continuation of learning. Okay, this is, we try to say to students, I think that was a big thing for students, is it wasn't just teachers. It was get students to understand that this is not just kind of optional homework. And we'd say, these are lessons. You have to do these in the same way you have to come and sit in front of your teacher and take part in those lessons. Treat this interactive content in exactly the same way. And I think one of the ways that we try to make it easier for them to understand this concept was to embed teachers into the flipped content itself. So we had like avatars and teachers sort of speech bubbles and things like that. So the idea was, oh, okay, they can see there's a human there. And this is one of the sort of good practices of developing any sort of digital content, is try to kind of humanize it. You put a person there, make it more conversational. And it did seem, from the feedback we got, the students would often mention this. Oh, they liked the avatar. They liked having the person there. They liked this feeling that there was kind of a teacher talking to them. We even modeled them on some teachers who were real teachers, just to...
Nice. Okay. So there's obviously two sides to the training. You've got your teachers who are, in the classroom with these materials, delivering them. And actually, before I jump onto that, there was something you said which I'll just query as well. You said about the distinct not treating the asynchronous learning as homework, the flip material as homework. Did you have a particular setup in place for teachers? How this is the flip material that we're working on, but here is the live session. So did you have a lesson that was talking them through what the live session should look like in the learning designer's mind, and how it complements rather than sort of repeats stuff?
I think we had like lesson notes and suggestions for lessons. I think there's always that difficulty, like how much, support do you give teachers? How much do you plan for them? How much do you let them do things themselves? Some teachers get very angry when the sort of lessons planned for them and they feel very restricted by it. Some teachers quite like that. So I think we tried to sort of tread a middle ground by having sort of lesson suggestions, saying, well, here are some things that you could do in the lesson. We might have some materials for it, but then we'd give a series of suggestions for ways that you could implement that. And I think teachers found that quite useful to have that. And I think it helped perhaps steer them away from just treating it like homework or sort of, we'd often say, well, you don't need to check through this. Mm-hmm. But, maybe now go on to this at the beginning of the lesson, just as a way of seeding into the class and extending what they've done for the flipped content.
I found it a tricky thing to do because I was designing some similar kind of materials for this. And in the end, I went with the option of having, let's say, a 90-minute class populated with essentially just discussion questions. So I get categorized discussion questions. These review the tasks that you did. These are sort of critical discussion questions which extend the topics that were covered in the flip materials and things like that. And it met with mixed reviews. I think it wasn't something that I was able to develop. I was only working on it for a couple of years, so it'd be interesting to see, over time how it pans out. But it was tough. I found it quite hard to find something that teachers would get. It's this cliche almost of trying to please so many people, and one of the criticisms I got was that as you say, the material's been covered. What am I doing in the class?
It's very undermining in some ways to the role of the teacher in terms of what they're supposed to actually do. Because you've taken out a big chunk of what a teacher normally does, and it's like, well, okay, what do I do now? What's my role now in the classroom? How am I normally present, passive voice or something like that, but now that's been taken away and the passive voice has been presented in a slightly different format. What do I do now in the classroom situation? And it's always because then you're going on to things like discussion and practice and analysis, and I think that's where you, as a teacher, often you feel a bit less less in control in the class, and so it's a lot more scary, that type of teaching, I think, than when you've got a very clear set of things you need to present and check in the lesson.
Yeah, definitely. I think that was. I'm not sure if this is something that's peculiar to English for academic purposes. I mean, I think there's. It might be true for a lot of subjects as well, but the sheer amount of one of the things I think that's harmed teaching, the way technology has harmed teaching, is the sheer availability of resources that are online at the moment. So, texts you could exploit, instructional materials, and a lot of them are really, really high quality that are freely available, even on YouTube or something like that, things that you could do and you feel obliged to cover as a teacher. And it's become, English for academic purposes is something that I've observed most closely, and it seems to be that it's almost led to a lapse back into information transmission, because you had this movement of flipped learning, I think sort of mid to late noughties, and always it seemed to be battling this tide almost of resource overload where it was difficult to step back in the class and just have a kind of discussion-led session, because you felt like the temptation to be the sage on the stage was,
And, they're often quite dense syllabuses, EAP syllabuses. It's like we have to cover all of these things. You have to, cover, writing summaries and paraphrases and this and that. And there's this whole thing. It's like, well, I can't, there's no time to discuss things. I've got to cover all of this content and I've got to get through all this content. And I think that's perhaps one of the dangers. I think that's one of the struggles we had during COVID was, we sort of densified our syllabus a little bit again. And went back to writing content for teachers, because I think we were, we're so worried that they were struggling with the technology side of things that we thought, well, if they'll struggle with both the content and the technology, so we focused on taking as much of the strain from the materials as possible by, creating lots of lesson plans for them and slides and things like that, so that we could help them and focus more on just, letting them work out how to use the technology better, I think. And I don't know if you had a similar issue at York, like, how much support do you give teachers, when they're teaching online, and whether you create the materials for them, and whether that's helpful or not.
One of the things that we did provide training in a sort of ad hoc sense, because it was because we were sort of doing this as we went. It was a bit strange at York. One of the things that happened coincidentally is we got Xerti installed as our sort of e-learning authoring tool, and Xerti requires quite a bit of training. So I enthusiastically went on to a bunch of these training courses, started getting my hands dirty, and then the pandemic hit. So we had to, I've been using Google platforms for delivering slightly different materials to normal, making them slightly like an e-textbook. And because most of our students were China-based, that was no longer an option. So we were using things like Xerti, Bootstrap, and Blackboard, and trying to put things together. A lot of it was just done as we go. I mean, I remember at the time learning by doing a lot, and often designing things 1 week ahead of their delivery. But that was the pandemic, and so that was quite unusual. I think if people were to do this now, so people are thinking, I like the idea, and how do I get people trained up, and how much time does it take? I think it would take a significant time investment. I mean, it is to get people on board, because I think from what I've seen, what would happen is if you said to module leaders who usually design teaching materials in a certain way with maybe they produce very good document-based teaching, but we'd like to make them, we've got this technology, we'd like you to make the classes slightly more interactive and take advantage of instant feedback and change the ethos slightly. And therefore, we'd like you to use H5P, Articulate, Xerti, whatever it is. The training would be tough. We'd have to allocate time, and ultimately you'd have to, this is a question I was going to ask you as well, is like how you got everyone on board with this. It's a case of the technical training, but also the buy-in. So teachers, module leaders, learning designers have to see the value in what you're doing and delivering materials in this way in order to keep it going. Yeah, because I think there's always a danger of putting on these training sessions, which are in themselves time-consuming and expensive, and they need people's attention. And if you don't get the buy-in from the underlying ideology and saying that this is a good idea, then it could all be for naught, because people will basically go back to designing materials in their preferred way, and it might be good, but you end up with a sort of fragmented delivery with some modules looking like having a very different look and feel to others, and it's all at the moment still I think there's only one or two modules that properly utilize e-learning tools like this and on a regular basis. And in the university generally we have a Xerti user group, and there's still training sessions, but it's a small circle it's like a small close-knit community, and I don't think I might be doing them injustice here, but I don't think there's been a huge amount of impact in the wider university itself. I think it's localized. It's modules that are kind of experimental and interested in doing this stuff. I don't know how much that chimes with Sheffield, because obviously you've made a much bigger investment with Articulate. And
yeah, I think I've got to give a lot of credit to our, my boss here at the English Language Teaching Centre, who quite early on recognised the value of technology and having dedicated personnel whose job it was to support technology within a centre. And I know at universities particularly, there'll often be like a learning technologist, within a department or a faculty or whatever, whose job it is to help the teaching staff with technology. I think, what we innovated in, I think, was to say to you that, the technologist should also be a pedagogue as well at the same time. So it wasn't about bringing in someone else who's technically quite proficient to work with a teacher who's not technically so proficient. It was about training up teachers so that they could sort of half their time be dedicated to materials creation, half their time dedicated to teaching, but that, one would inform the other all the time. So that, they didn't constantly have to ask questions like, well, should it be done this way? Because they understood the material they were working with. So I think that was always the problem, perhaps working with learning technologists, is that they didn't understand the content necessarily that they were working with because it wasn't their speciality. But we made sure that all of our teams who were developing the content were teachers as well. So during development of flipped content, we did, and our boss was really good at allowing time for these teachers to develop, and giving them permission, giving them time off to train themselves or be part of training sessions with me to develop the skills to be able to create this content. We developed our own internal courses for this as well. We have a course called the Instructional Design course for language teachers. We also offer that externally, but originally it was an internal course that I just ran for staff members, which took several months to complete, with me every week. And this developed a small team of people who were able to then create flipped content pre-pandemic. And then when the pandemic came along, we did have quite a nice cadre of teachers who were able to then develop content during the pandemic. And I think that's where teachers really began to understand the value of this, because, I'm sure it's the same with you. Suddenly we were in a position where you just couldn't offer that many hours in a week. So we had to, the course had to be bulked out with other things. And suddenly we needed to generate lots of digital content. And, PDFs, Word documents just weren't fitting the bill at that point. It needed to be something more substantial than that. And that's when we had a really good team of teachers who were able to develop this content. So it enabled us to work through the pandemic and have banks of content that could fill up quite a few hours in a week. There may only be a couple of hours teaching, but then there were, 10 hours of online content that students could interact.
You're working at the English Language Teaching Centre in Sheffield. This seems to be, is the use of e-authoring tools more widespread in the university, or are you guys kind of leading the charge on that?
I think we are leading the charge a little bit. I don't think they're used quite as widely at the university. I think perhaps there are greater restrictions at the university. I think that's, those restrictions are beginning to apply a bit more to us as well around data security and all of these kinds of things. But we had a lot of freedom to use these tools, and perhaps budget as well to use them, because I think that's the other thing. Obviously, they are quite expensive, and so we had the financial capacity to afford these, to be able to use them. And I think, we go to talk to the universities, and it seems like most departments don't use that. So they tend to use sort of built-in VLE tools and things like that. They're not using these very sort of rich, sort of media-based e-authoring tools to create a lot of their content as well. But again, similarly, for the reasons I discussed, because they don't necessarily have that kind of the teachers or the professors with the technical knowledge to be able to do that. They're reliant on this kind of the teacher or the professor creating some content that then being sent to a learning technologist who then has to look at it, try to work out how best to convert that into something digital, constant sort of back and forth, trying to understand the content and understand what they want. Whereas I think in our context, often the person writing the material might be the person who creates, the digital content as well, or intimately understands the digital content they're creating. I think that allows us to create so much more content for that reason. But it's not something that's really been taken up, I don't think. And I don't know if it's similar York or whatever, where there is quite a clear, pedagogical and technical division within departments?
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of different teams. We have a learning technology team, an academic practice team, and there are places where they come together, but it probably could do with being a bit more joined up than it is. I suspect, given the size of universities generally, this is probably quite a common thing. Just departments operating in more independently. So in the 2.5 minutes we've got left, you mentioned AI earlier, and I guess it's worth asking here if this has made much difference to the way you're using these tools. I found it's Gemini and more recently Copilot have been great for generating content which go into finished learning objects. Have you found similar? What are you? How are you using these tools at the moment?
Yeah, I think similar to you, it's good for generating. It's quite good for generating sort of classroom materials and like say texts and quick activities and things like that. It's really, really, really good for that. We've done a lot of training with teachers on how they can use it for that. I don't think it's necessarily at this stage impacting a lot sort of asynchronous digital materials. I think one thing we have used a fair amount is sort of voice-based AI for creating audio for videos and things like that, because I think that's always a challenge is getting, as you're probably finding, trying to record a podcast, it's getting really good audio is a real challenge. And so we've been using a tool, I think it's from a company called 11 Labs, which voice generates audio for scripts so that we can have really good, clear. Because in the past, you used to get that very robotic sounding voice, whereas now, the quality is so much better now, and it sounds very authentic in it. And we had to create some materials for a project for Turkey, and it was a great way for us to vary, for example, accent. So because they wanted different accents in the content. It's very difficult for us as a school to someone pretend to be American and someone pretend to be this, and so we had
someone who's up for it.
There's always someone, but then it's getting the quality of audio as well. It's the microphones and background noise and all of those things is really tricky. But you can use these tools to generate pretty authentic sounding audio. Different genders, different countries, and that was incredibly useful and such a time saver as well. And I think with AI, a lot of it is about sort of time saving.
Absolutely. Nice. All right, David, well, time has destroyed us.
Yes.
But just to say thank you very much for this. It's been great, and so much more we could talk about on this.
It's a pleasure to talk to you, Phil.
Nice one. Okay.
Right.